So, you ever stop and think about where the rules that run our markets actually come from? Well, it turns out they're often forged in the fires of a major crisis. Today, we're going to dive into how one of the biggest financial disasters in history ended up creating a new language of trust for investors. And what's really fascinating is how that same blueprint is so incredibly important for our future. All right, so it all kicks off right here. In the fall of 1929, the global financial system was just rocked to its absolute core. And look, this wasn't just a bad day on Wall Street. This was the start of a total catastrophe that would go on to redefine the entire world economy for a decade. And what a catastrophe it was. By June of 1932, the market had lost over 80% of its value. You have to remember, this wasn't just numbers on a page. This was life savings evaporating into thin air, businesses failing left and right, and the beginning of just widespread hardship. Okay, so let's really get into this. To understand how we can even begin to fix some of today's problems, we have to go back and understand what went so horribly wrong back then. This was way more than just a market correction. At its heart, it was a fundamental crisis of trust. You know, what's just crazy is how fast it all fell apart. It was like a domino effect. It started in London back in September with a crash that was fueled by fraud. Just 1 month later, that same chaos hit New York. And by the end of the year, the whole world was plunging headfirst into the Great Depression. It was a brutal, brutal chain reaction. So when the dust settled and investigators started digging through the wreckage, what did they actually find? Well, it wasn't just bad economic policy. At its very core, the system was broken because information was broken. Fraud was everywhere, companies were hiding critical details, and investors were essentially making huge decisions based on lies. There was simply no transparency. But, out of all that chaos, a really powerful new idea started to emerge. The thinking was, if the sickness was secrecy, then the cure had to be transparency. A whole new philosophy for how markets should work was about to be born. And this new way of thinking, it was captured perfectly years before the crash even happened by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. His point was that public exposure, shining a light on how businesses really operate, was the single best way to cure all these, social and industrial diseases. This idea, it became the guiding principle for everything that came next. So this led to the concept of mandatory corporate disclosure. The idea itself is pretty simple, right? Force companies to release all relevant information about what they're doing to the public. This principle became the absolute bedrock of new regulatory bodies, like the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which was set up in 1934 with one clear mission: protect investors. Now, this is really key. You have to understand that disclosure had two main goals. The first one is obvious: protect investors by giving them the actual facts. But the second goal, that's the one that's often overlooked. The reformers hoped that the simple act of being watched, of having to report everything publicly, would fundamentally change corporate behavior for the better. Okay, so having this philosophy of disclosure, that's a great start, but it's not the whole story. I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, everyone share your information, but it's a whole other thing to make that information actually understandable and, comparable. This next phase was all about building a common language. Because in the beginning, even with these new laws, financial reports were an absolute mess. A total free-for-all. Every company, every accounting firm, they all did things their own way. It was like everyone was speaking a different dialect of the same language, which made any kind of true apples-to-apples comparison totally impossible for investors. The big light bulb moment really came in the 1960s with this huge philosophical shift. Accounting basically went from being a history book, what did this thing cost way back when, to becoming a tool for the future. The question became, what information do investors actually need to make smart judgments about what's coming next? And this new purpose, it's what led to the creation of some really powerful standard-setting bodies. Organizations like the IASC, which later became the IASB, and the FASB in the US, they were created to turn that theory into real-world practice. They're the ones who built the standardized accounting principles, like GAAP in the US, that became the common language of global finance we use today. And that right there brings us to today. We solved the last crisis, we built a language of trust, and the markets, they ran on it for decades. But now we're facing a brand new information gap, and boy, does it have some uncanny echoes of the past. Just look at this. The change has been absolutely dramatic. Back in 1975, over 80% of a company's value was in stuff you could actually touch. Factories, equipment, inventory. Fast forward to today, and that has completely flipped. Now most of a company's value is in intangible stuff, like its brand, its patents, its data. And therein lies the problem, right? The language of accounting that we spent decades perfecting was designed to talk about those physical things. It doesn't do a great job of capturing these new drivers of value or, for that matter, new and massive risks like climate change. We're missing a huge part of the story. The result? Well, it should sound eerily familiar. We are drowning in a sea of sustainability reports and ESG data, but a lot of it is inconsistent and unreliable. It's the 1930s all over again. We've got tons of information, but no common language to make it comparable and actually useful for making decisions. Okay, but here's the hopeful part. History doesn't just show us the problem. It actually gives us a really clear blueprint for the solution. We have literally done this before, and we can do it again. The pattern is just so clear when you lay it out. Step 1. A crisis shows you where the transparency is missing. Step 2. We, as a society, embrace a new philosophy of mandatory disclosure to fill that gap. And step 3, we all work together to build a common, standardized language to make that disclosure meaningful. It's a proven formula. The language of business is simply evolving once again. It's not about throwing out the old dictionary, not at all. It's about adding a new chapter. We need to create the words and the grammar for things like carbon emissions, water security, and human capital, so we can accurately describe what a 21st century company actually is. So this all leaves us with a really critical question, doesn't it? The generation that lived through the Great Depression built a language of trust basically from scratch, and it powered decades of prosperity. The challenge for our generation now is to do it again, to evolve that language for a truly sustainable future.